Good afternoon, sorry, that was loud. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today at the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. We are thrilled and delighted to be joined by an extraordinary panel of people. Our own senior fellow, Sean McFate, has written a very interesting new book that is frankly shaking the industrial defense complex with its iconoclastic new rules. This is the kind of conversation that we are rarely able to have in the Africa Center. But Sean's experience as a paratrooper and then as a private security contractor in a number of African conflicts was what informed his thinking on these subjects. And he is going to be joined today by Natalya, who is with the International Crisis Group and is the foremost expert on the conflict in the Central African Republic, a nation which has seen more than its fair share of dirty, unconventional tactics in recent years. Enhancing and moderating the conversation, we're honored to have Julian Barnes, who is a distinguished national security correspondent for the New York Times. This conversation is on the record. And not only is it on the record, but Sean has provided a cheat sheet which we will be distributing. If you have read it, your eyebrows are already raising, and you know that this is going to be an extraordinary conversation. I am honor-bound, unfortunately, to say a brief word about the Africa Center. I'm going to read it from a card because it's difficult. Founded by former National Security Advisor General James Jones a decade ago, the Africa Center's mission is to promote dynamic geopolitical partnerships with African states and to shape U.S. and European policy priorities to strengthen security and promote economic growth and prosperity on the continent. Okay, so all formalities observed, it's my honor to welcome Sean McFate to the stage. Please join me.
Thank you. So thank you for coming out on a Wednesday afternoon. Today, as you know, it marks the 75th anniversary of DDay, June 6, 1944. The Western Allies landed on the shores of Normandy, and anybody who've walked the beaches of Normandy, it is a sight to behold. As a former 82nd Airborne paratrooper, this day is particularly hallowed, given the role of the 82nd paratroopers in that operation. I spent 8 years in the Army, most of it in the paratroopers. My commanders were Stanley McChrystal, David Petraeus, when they were just colonels before they became who they were. And I thought that was really cool, you know. But I left. This is going to make you laugh. I left in 2000 thinking that the future would be nothing but peacekeeping, and I didn't want to do that. So I ended up through various ways in the private military industry in Africa, and there I saw a type of warfare that I had never seen before or trained for. I was involved with dealing with warlords in Western Africa, demobilizing Charles Taylor's army, raising a new army from scratch, riding in the Sahara with armed groups for extractive industry, doing arms deals from Eastern Europe to West Africa, and even helped prevent a genocide in the Rwanda Great Lakes region in 2004. What I saw on the ground convinced me that the war and warfare that we train for, that we buy equipment for here in this country, is antiquated, and that's the problem. Like you, well, I wrote this book, The New Rules of War. First of all, The New Rules of War is written in an accessible way. It's written like it's a magazine. You could read it in the airport, because I wanted my mother to be able to read it, basically. And I wrote this book because I was angry. Like maybe some of you, I have lost friends in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and other places. As an American taxpayer, it's egregious to me that we've spent trillions of dollars in these places and the situation has only gotten worse on the ground. And as a vet, it hurts me to see our national honor impugned by low-level foes. Yet we have the best military in the world, right? We have the best troops, the best training, the best equipment, the best technology, the most money. Did you know that our military has more money than the next 8 militaries in the world combined? Yet the last time we won a war decisively was 1945. The world ran on vacuum tubes. So what's the problem? And that's what this book is about. It tries to answer the question of what's the problem? We have the best military. Even our adversaries know that. But we're still losing. And I'll tell you quickly what the problem is up front. Warfare has changed, but we have not. War has moved on, but we have not. Our adversaries grasp this, but we are stuck. You've heard this saying, generals always fight the last war, right? Or generals always fight the last successful war. This truism happens to be true. And for us, the last war was World War II. It was conventional war. But nobody fights that way anymore, except for us. If you look at, there's nothing more unconventional than conventional wars. If you look at social study data like the correlates of war, if you look at all conflicts from 1945 to today, you'll see that conventional wars flatline, whereas everything else spikes. For 70 years, that's the trend. Yet, what are we preparing for? Conventional war still. I like to say that budgets are moral documents because they do not lie. If you look at the Department of Defense's POM, it's what they're buying in the future. It's all conventional weapons. We're buying Ford-class carriers at $13 billion a copy before you add sailors or aircraft. And those carriers do not deter China from taking the South China Sea, right? We're buying more F-35s. The F-35, you know how much money we've spent on the F-35? U.S. taxpayers and allies will spend $1.5 trillion on this airplane. Trillion. That's bigger than Russia's GDP. If this airplane was a nation state, it would be 11th in the world, ahead of Saudi Arabia and India. So, and in 2 long wars, how many combat missions has it racked up? Does anybody know? How many combat missions? 0. 0 combat missions. 2 long wars. I mean, they flew a couple in Afghanistan last fall to but I'm an old infantry grunt, and if the enemy can't shoot back, it's not a combat mission, right? So we're buying conventional war weapons for a post-conventional war era, and that's what the book's about. And so what is conventional war? Conventional war it's the Westphalian way of war. We live in a post-Westphalian era. The Westphalian order, this book is about something I call durable disorder. If you look at the biggest threats in the world, we can think of China, Russia, all these things. But the biggest threat is systemic. It's called durable disorder. And what durable disorder is, it's once the Westphalian system of nation states retreats, and we know it has been retreating for 25 years, it's what's left in the wake. It is not anarchy. It is not the sky is falling, invest in more sky. It's a chaotic system of persistent conflict. It is a system that can contain problems but not solve them. And it is what most of the world looks like. From Africa to the Middle East to South Asia to parts of Latin America. It is, and its way of warfare looks like the sheet of paper you have in front of you. The 10 new rules of war explains how to fight and win in this new global environment. The global environment has changed, and that changes warfare. But our systems, our bureaucracy, the way we strategically think, what we buy, how we fight, how we train, it is all according to old rules of war that no longer are relevant. And then we get frustrated when we don't achieve things on the ground strategically. Tactically and operationally, we are the best in the world. We have the best military in the world. But our strategic thinking is still around 1945. Recently, as you know, the National Defense Strategy came out last year. It recognized the rise of global disorder as a threat. And it also said we're going to be sort of hinging towards great power competition. The way that is commonly read in this town is more conventional war. Hence, we're buying more F-35s, and we're buying like robots and AI and all this stuff, which is nonsense. technology, if you look at the last 70 years of warfare, if there's anything that should stand out as this, it's that technology does not matter in war. Luddites continually to beat big technological militaries from France and Algeria, France and Indochina, UK and Palestine, the Soviets in Afghanistan, the United States in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. Technology is not decisive. Where are we doubling down on? Technology. It's called the third offset strategy. So we suffer because we are paradigm prisoners of a Westphalian way of war in a post-Westphalian world. And this book proposes 10 ways to fix it, 10 new rules, 10 new ideas of new warfare. The first rules 1 through 4, are things that we have to stop doing. And rules 5 through 10 are things we have to start doing. To a conventional warrior, it will make their heads explode. In the future, victory goes to the cunning and not the strong. And we can talk a little bit over Q&A about how to do that. But this book is meant to help shift a paradigm and create an intellectual insurgency so that we don't create a Maginot Line only to have it routed to our utter surprise in 1941. Right now, we are creating and buying our version of the Maginot Line. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sean. We have with us now to react to Sean, Natalya is a researcher and analyst for the Enough Project and the Sentry. She's spent the last decade working in studying the Central African Republic. She's just come from there recently. Sean's book comes out of the experience of Africa. It is shaped by the kinds of conflicts there. And so we want Natalya to react to Sean's comments, to place them in a real place, and to see if the kind of disorder, this durable disorder that Sean is talking about in the book, does that ring true to you? How is this really playing out in CAR?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm really glad to be here today. And I mean, the moment I started reading Durable Disorder, it really rang a bell because as you said, I mean, I'm spending 10 years studying, researching CAR, durable disorder. It was for me like taking some perspective and stepping back a little bit, because by analyzing in detail, a complex system in the center of Africa, like the way he has been describing disorder really apply to CAR. So let me explain. So when the Central African Republic made the headline in 2013, 2014, barely no one knew where it was and if it was even a country. People would say, is it a territory in the middle of Africa? And actually, back at that time, I was like, how is it possible that people don't even know a country in Africa? But when they were talking about a territory, actually, I think they were not wrong, because this country has like progressively and over time sinking into a structural crisis. And it started, of course, I mean, there are historical reasons, but that became more evident and even deeper with what you call unconventional war after 2013. In 2007, the crisis group mentioned CAR as a phantom state, and describing a long history of political instability, insecurity, and most importantly, the persistent foreign interferences that have been playing in CAR. As a weak territory, those powers have been able to play a strong role in what we see today. So what's CAR today? let's say that it's a territory. I'd like to call it this way. The size of France and Belgium together, and it's today ruled by a myriad of warlords that are ruling some, like having kingdom basically, and with predatory elites, and occupied by a peacekeeping mission worth 12,000 people. What we've seen is the proliferation in the past 15 years of armed groups from Central Africa, from CAR, but also infiltrated more and more by foreign mercenaries from Chad, Sudan, but also Congo in some extent. And today, they've been progressively supported to become political military groups, despite that they behave as mercenaries, which religion is money. Sometimes we can see that they wage war between each other, fighting for resources for some part of territory. And sometimes they decide to ally and threaten the central government, or just, threaten to overthrow the government, and sometimes just overthrow the government. This conflict seems to be a civil war. Like from any external actors, you will think, okay, this is a war between the Christians and the Muslims, or between ethnic groups. But in fact, it's more like a proxy war. It's foreign interests being reflected through these different groups. And you will have, the central government, let's say the ruling network, all these different groups ruling the different part of the territory, being instrumentalized at the negotiating table. So what's the so-called dialogue, political dialogue. And behind the scene, it's a lot of interests, foreign actors' interests that are being at stake. And by foreign actors, it can be economic, but also state interests. And this is what makes it so difficult to solve, because there are so many actors now involved in this conflict. I'm sure we'll be able to talk about, who are the key players, but everyone heard in 2018 when Russia announced the delivery of arms, and China is about to deliver arms. So there are like key foreign powers involved in the durable disorder. And I would like to finish with one quote that that really caught my attention in your book. It says, "In the coming decades, we will see wars without states, and countries will become prizes to be won by more powerful global actors. Many nation states will exist in name only, as some practically already do." And to me, it's what applies to CAR. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalya. Sean, could you react to that a little bit? It does seem that what she is describing here is very much hits on a couple of the rules you're talking about. This rise of mercenary forces here, the new types of which is Rule 6, Rule 7, the new types of world powers. But also, Rule 9, she just mentioned the presence of Russia and China, the shadow wars, belligerent world powers interfering. How does that scenario in CAR and also elsewhere in Africa, how is this demonstrating what you're writing about here?
So when we think about what warfare is, we often go to things like Hollywood. We think of like John Wayne and Iwo Jima. We think Saving Private Ryan. We have a specific paradigm for what warfare is. Now warfare is loosening its bond from the nation state, from the Westphalian order. And we're getting to something that looks more medieval, frankly, or more ancient, where there are no national armies. There is a market for force. Mercenaries are the second oldest profession in the world for a reason. And they marketize war, and that changes warfare profoundly. We're seeing, as soon as you have mercenaries, and these mercenaries, by the way, are not just like lone guys in the Congo with a Kalashnikov. They are like the Wagner group, a Russian group that almost it battled Delta Force and Rangers last year in the eastern Syria with our best aviation, our best troops, and it took our best 4 hours to push back 500 mercenaries. What happens when there's 5,000 mercenaries? These are not fools. Once you have mercenaries, that means that the super rich can hire them and wage war for any reason they want, and they can become superpowers. And we're seeing this, whether it be oligarchs, maybe the extractive industry in the future, and then you'll have wars without states, which we're talking about here. And it's not just CAR. I mean, think about like Latin America. In Latin America, you can look at it through the Westphalian lens of looking at grid lines on maps that denote states, or you can take your goggles of Westphalia off and look at where power nodes are, where people and populations are, and you'll see that the states, it's artificial. And that states no longer drive war, they can even become booty of war. We call them narco-states, like Guatemala, Salvador. So we're seeing this way of warfare emerge around the world everywhere, yet our national security establishment, the West, quote unquote, in general, thinks of it all as a regular war or lesser war, and that's fine until, Rome thought itself to be the eternal city until 410 AD, and everything ends. So I am trying to sort of bring attention to this new global environment that she's describing in CAR that we're seeing elsewhere around the world.
Natalya, you were saying in your recent visit, you were in Central African Republic's second city, which is effectively controlled by a warlord, and in some ways more effective than the notional government there. Tell us a little bit about what you've seen about these sort of what we would in Washington call non-state actors, but these groups that control territory, that run people, and why, and what do you see the effect on individual countries, on the region as a whole? How do you see this playing out in CAR or elsewhere?
So I visited a city called Bambari. It's a town in the center of the country, very rich in minerals, particularly gold, and there's a lot of it's also a key path for cows coming from Chad, and actually from sub-Saharan Africa country, So it's economically strategic. And a warlord established in 2014 in that area and never left, despite the French troops that tried to remove them, they stayed. And what we've seen is that they developed a very sophisticated parallel taxation system. And I mean, they're like acting as a state inside the state. They deliver documents with their flag and with stamps, with direct general direction of mines or or transport. It's quite it's really sophisticated. And then the money that they collect is used to pay for the combatants and make sure that they can live. They can cover their cost of living, and that they can attract young men who actually have no space to work. They have no opportunities elsewhere. But the first employee in CAR are armed groups. So in that context, it's really difficult to bring back the nation state, and especially in a country that has never experimented a nation state. And I should add the fact that there are contingents from the UN mission, peacekeeping mission, and supposedly it's a city that is under control because they managed to ensure the men are not carrying openly arms. But in fact, it's in their house, and the minute the order is passed, then it can blow up again. The contingents in that area, and I want to flag that because you mentioned peacekeeping, and I really believe that sometimes can be part of the durable disorder theme. there is a contingent from Mauritania. And I mean, it can be Mauritania or another country, but it turns out that this contingent has the same language, use the same language, has the same religion, is from the same ethnic group as this warlord. So it's creating some extremely high tensions between communities. And as a consequence, you see that communities affiliated to the armed group will be seen as complicit to the crimes committed by this group. And then you see that in one city, the Christians or animists are in one side, and all the other are in the other side. And so, what's the alternative? It's extremely difficult because the current system kind of encourages this durable disorder, and the armed group has no interest in withdrawing. It has all its power comes from the control of the territory, the economic revenues, etc., etc. So
we can see situations like this all around the world. And in your book, you point out a number of places, not just in Syria or Somalia that would come to mind, but also places in Mexico,
Right.
where the state no longer exercises control. We've had a series of presidents who've disavowed nation building only to then go and try their hand at it. What do you think, Sean, that the United States or West as a large strategy should be when we have a nation state that has essentially disappeared, whether it is in Africa or in the Middle East or in North America?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would say that the world that we grew up in 6th grade reading about is not accurate. We grew up reading that states are the global political unit of the world. They're timeless and universal. They have national armies, only they can wage war. But in fact, if you look at the history of the world, states are only about a few hundred years old. Before there were states, there were empires, there were tribes, and world politics look fundamentally different. Durable disorder is simply a return to normal. It's returning back to that, to the status quo ante of the sort of the Peace of Westphalia era. And we don't have what we need. Our foreign policy is still mired in the past, where we have the Humpty Dumpty approach to foreign policy. We're trying to recreate the liberal world order that we imagine, whether it's real or not, is one question, and whether we could actually feasibly resurrect it is another. I say it's too late. And what we need and lack is a grand strategy for a durable disorder era. We need like an NC 68 or something like that to steer us. Because right now, grand strategies are rudderless ship in the ocean of international affairs. We have none. We have not had any since containment. And as such, every 4 to 8 years, our strategy changes. And we have to think about how do you leverage power, how do you survive, what does victory look like in an era that is basically post-Westphalian?
I'm going to have you develop that, but first I want to ask Natalya, what do you think the West, Europe, the United States should do in a situation like the Central African Republic or another place where the state is weakened? Right now, intervention by outside powers, it's hard to say that it's a positive impact on these places. What is your best advice to policymakers in Europe and America about how do you help the situation, not worsen the situation?
it's a complicated answer because maybe I should go back to the fact that I mentioned a proxy war. And so even though we see that there are non-state actors fighting against each other, but also the ruling network being involved in that conflict, behind the scene, I mentioned, there are different actors. I could start with France and Russia and China, regional powers, Sudan and Chad, for instance. But also for a long time, South Africa has been interested in, for instance, diamonds or do military training. In the past, Gaddafi also try to take, to have a basis in car. It's too strategic. So what makes it very difficult is you have different interests that involve superpowers, like Russia, like China, like the French, like those actors. And someone from an armed group said to me recently, as long as the white people don't let us in peace, we will continue fighting. I thought it was interesting because, he was part of an armed group, but what he was trying to tell me is there are like actors at the back that are like playing a game. And it's true that, like, for instance, when there was a clash in Bambari, the city where I was, one armed group was fighting against the contingent from Portugal, so the UN peacekeeping mission. They were fighting, and there was a roadblocks, and at this roadblock there was a French flag, and on the other side there were some military forces being trained by the Russians, but also the Russians, probably from the Wagner group, helping them fight back the rebels. So it's extremely complicated because as long as those really waging war don't sit down and find a compromise, then you can. What we've seen is an agreement signed in Khartoum in February between the armed groups and the government. But what really matters is who are those involved in the conflict and what did they really agree.
So, Sean, that's a sort of perfect segue to the end of your book, where, as we sit in Washington and we are talking to military or policymakers about the great power competition, right. We get people will weave a scenario of Chinese AI versus right. United States AI, and our drones fighting faster than man can think over the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. And in your book, you outline a future of shadow wars, which right. look a lot more like what Natalya is talking about there than what we in Washington have been talking about. So react to that a little bit.
So when you ask most war futurists, they think they're looking straight ahead in the future, but they're looking in the rearview mirror. They're thinking that if you ask all these conversations in town, what the future of war looks like, they'll say it looks like World War II with better technology. This is not new. In World War I, they said the same thing. In World War I, the victorious nations like France and England said, well, the future of war is going to look like static line trench warfare. And so what was their super weapon? The Maginot Line, the biggest trench war in the world. So we're doing the same thing. We're investing in like AI and robots and all this tactical stuff. But that's not how great powers are winning. You look at what Iran is doing in Syria, that's a shadow war. Okay, you look at how Russia took the Crimea. Let's look at Russia for an example. Russia, in the old rules of war, when Russia wanted to, take or put down an uppity province, how would they do it? I was asking you, how would they do it in the Soviets? Invade. They used tanks, right? Like Hungary, 56, Czechoslovakia, 68. They could have done that with Crimea and eastern Ukraine, but they didn't. What they did, they fought the new rules of war. They used covert and clandestine means, like Spetsnaz, special forces, mercenaries like the Wagner Group, it's these proxies, the Donbass battalions, little green men, lots of propaganda and active measures. They created the fog of war and exploited it for victory. They're fighting shadow war. So that when policymakers are here, we're still scratching their heads and wondering when they can send in the robots or the AI or whatever, the F-35s, they're like, is this war, is this not war? By the time the Russian warship showed up in Sevastopol, it was a fait accompli. The reason is this, is that in the old rules, modern war and international politics it's becoming epistemological. Discerning facts from falsehoods determines winners and losers the way that battlefield victory used to happen. So the utility of force is going down and cunningness goes up, and we're, cunning wins over force. We're investing in force, like the F-35, and our adversaries they're like, we're the bull, they're the matador with the cape. We're easy to manipulate, and that's how they're strategically outsmarting us. We have the best military, but our strategic thinking, our strategic IQ is currently low.
I'm going to open it up to questions in just a second. So be thinking of your question and make sure it is a question and not a comment on any of the rules of war or on the Central African Republic or anything germane to our conversation. But before I get to your questions, I want to ask both Sean and Natalya. Sean, in Sean's book, he talks about the possibility of the super wealthy hiring mercenaries, but not just a extractive energy company, but you raise the issue of Mia Farrow's sort of flirting with hiring a mercenary company for Darfur. Would it work for a NGO, for a wealthy person to hire executive outcomes, Blackwater, or whatever the current version of that is, to stop a genocide?
So it's a great question. So this book has lots of examples of what I'm talking about, and also some pretty forward-leaning solutions. It's possible someday in the future that like a mega church, mega churches have budgets of like $90 million. If there's ever another ISIS 2.0 or 3.0 and they start, crucifying Christian men in the Levant and selling women and girls to sex slave markets, I can see a mega church saying, phooey with the Westphalian International Order, we're going to hire, Mi-24 attack helicopters and special operation mercenaries, which are available. You can buy them or rent them, to go and kill ISIS, just to create a humanitarian intervention because the international community is so bereft in doing so. That is a scenario of using the market for force potentially for good. So I think that we have to get beyond the stigma of private force and see how it might be used in the future. Private force mercenaries, it's like fire. You can burn down your house, you can power a steam engine, but don't blame the fire, it's just fire.
Natalya, what do you think about that? What would the impact of a NGO hiring a mercenary company to sort of try to stop a genocide in somewhere in Africa? Is there any way that could go right, or is that just an intervention that's going to be impossibly wrong?
At the moment, what I'm observing is more the contrary. It's armed group recruiting individuals inside NGOs.
Interesting.
Yes, it happens. The contrary, I'm not, into science fiction, so the problem is that we have a reign of trafficking, it's at the moment what's really difficult is because of there's no more nation state basically, and it's opening the road for any criminal networks. And this is what's happening in CAR and in Central Africa more generally, is you're seeing like all sorts of individuals making a lot of money, but the people state remain poor, extremely poor actually. And this extremely extractive approach will be difficult to change unless there is really a big awareness about, how do we fight money laundering? How do we stop these individuals, international actors that are making money out of, chaos? At the moment, this is what I really believe is, NGOs can work, of course, and maybe mercenaries, but what we really need to do is a joint action to stop these networks from making money from, violence and poverty.
Let's take some questions here. I see the woman in the back there. State your name, ask a brief question.
My name is Natasha. I'm here on my own, not representing any organizations, but my question is related to proxy wars in so much as it's related to engaging minds, wherever those minds might be. Do you think that defeating, let's say, ISIS on the ground is only temporary because they could just pretty much recruit from anywhere?
So the answer, so those of, remember like a couple months ago, like we're defeating ISIS, we've driven them out of Mosul and Raqqa. That's the old rules of war. Old rules of war, Westphalian, it's about controlling territory, it's about flying your flag over the enemy's capital. It's like Napoleon. That's not how war works. So you can take Raqqa and you can take Mosul, but unless you can stake the ideology, you've taken nothing, right? Do we have any, how do we combat ideology? We're not very good at that here. But we have been in the past. The US, if you read, like the Cold War had a grand strategy and it talked about all this. We've done this all before. These rules look very familiar to a Cold Warrior, but we've forgotten them in the last 25 years, which is a curious thing. But I think that, in the future, as I said, war is becoming epistemological, where strategic influence is really important. So for example, when was the last time anybody in this room saw a Hollywood movie with China as the villain? Can you remember? They bought Hollywood. They greenlight every movie. You cannot make a bad movie about China. So if war's becoming epistemological, if strategic influence, if that's a center of gravity, they just bought the hugest megaphone on the planet, and they're building their own that they hope to eclipse. We're not getting it because even though we invented Hollywood and Madison Avenue, we're mired in the old rules of war. We don't understand the sort of the non-kinetic instruments of power very well.
Over here in the back.
Yeah.
Hi, Robert Shreda, international investor. If I could sneak in two quick ones. First, I didn't hear anything about our own special operations forces. By our own command's admission, we have them operating, or they have had operations in 138 nations around the world, and CAR as well. So I'm surprised we didn't hear mention of that. And the other is, this doesn't just happen to be billionaires. I mean, we could talk about private equity characters and others entering a potential revolution or civil war and picking a side and funding it.
Or picking a side and playing two sides against the middle. I mean, there's all sorts of, so when you marketize warfare, it's when it's like business strategy mixes with military strategy. Our current 4-stars, they've never had to think about that, and we're not prepared for this type of war. But it's out there. I mean, Machiavelli fought that type of war. And to your point about special operations forces, actually I do talk about it a great deal in this book, especially in rule number 9, which is shadow war. The reason why SOF is over-deployed everywhere all the time is because they work in modern warfare, whereas the F-35 does not. But we cannot make the whole military into special operations forces. That's bad for a lot of reasons. That's not possible. What I argue, and I've argued this to SOF units, is that how do we make the general purposes forces more SOF-like, How do we, that warrior ethos that we need, the sort of the flexibility of mind, and this is important. And so I also talk about other things in this book about maybe we need an American Foreign Legion. Now that's a very controversial idea. Now when I say Foreign Legion, what do you think? I see people's thought bubbles and they think of Jean-Claude Van Damme, right? That's what you're thinking. No, so the American Foreign Legion it's a French military unit with enlisted from all over the world. And they do things in a different way, and they can stay in zones of disorder that matter for very long periods of time. Right now, we can't do that. So, and it fixes the problems of unruly contractors, of unreliable proxies, and we don't want to have huge boots on the ground. So there may be a door D, which is a Foreign Legion concept.
Natalya, could you react to a second? In your experience in CAR, elsewhere, have you seen a positive impact, a negative impact, any impact from French special forces or American training efforts in the region? Does that translate on the ground in any way that that somebody living in CAR or a neighboring country would ever, think impacts their life?
I mean, when in 2014 the French launched their operation called Sangares, it was about 2,000 men, soldiers. They tried to control the situation in the context that, Christians started to target the Muslims, and we were facing an ethnic cleansing, literally, with hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the country and finding refuge in the regional countries. According to French politicians, they managed to stop the slaughter. So they control the situation, and probably it's true. But the fact is, and as you described very well, is the disorder continued. They went to Bambari, tried to get rid of the mercenaries, but they stopped. And they kind of accepted the situation that they will remain in control of that area. Special units even, I think, help them organize in some ways. As long as they're not targeting the French interests, their friend, it's fine, So, I mean, saying that it's the answer, it depends what is the objective. If the objective is French interest or your own interests, then probably you do a good job. But if it's about building peace, maybe not.
Sean, could you react to that very point? Because we have heard for 15 years within Washington people talking about working with partner forces by, with, and through. We, as the questioner mentioned, huge deployments of special operations all over the world. What should the goal of those deployments be? I mean, is it possible to fight against the sort of disorder that you show is the norm in your book?
So special operations forces alone cannot do much. It has to be in parallel with, economic influence, like lawfare or something like that. I mean, they have to be one of many things, and we tend to overstate what they can do. But I do think that when it comes to training partnership capacity, there's two types of soft. There's dark soft and white soft. Black soft are the door kickers that come out of helicopters and do renditions, right? White soft are different. They live with an indigenous force, and they live with them for 6 months to a year, and they train and equip them. And build capacity, defense capacity, police capacity. That is good, but that training and equipping alone doesn't fix things. All that gives you are better dressed soldiers who shoot straighter. It doesn't create an armed forces. It doesn't give you leadership. It doesn't create a Ministry of Defense or a vetting. There's no vetting. We would never dream of putting a cop on the street in D.C. without a background check. We used to do that every day in Afghanistan and Iraq. Why there's no human rights vetting? So how we do security force assistance, that's a different question, different book, but that needs to substantially improve.
Questions? Here in the front, in the gentleman with the beard,
And my name is Eric Neri. I come from IQ Latino. And my question is, a point you touched upon was, during the Cold War, sustained sort of permanence within countries that don't have this leadership or don't have this capacity to place leadership, in cases such as Germany, sustained permanence of the United States and Japan. Those cases actually worked for the sustain. And my question is this strategy, why hasn't it been sort of implemented anymore, sort of sustained and and be there for many sort of years to create that that environment.
So where that's been done are like Germany, Japan, Korea, the Philippines. I don't think Americans have the appetite for Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria to do that. Less than 1% of America serves in uniform. And that's, so how do you have a country that wants to do force projection but doesn't want to bleed, right? So what do? Well, the military gets over-deployed all the time, and they're aware of this, and they don't like that. Second is that you hire a lot of contractors. And that's what rich countries do when they want to do force, boots on the ground without actually having their own citizens, whether it's the United States and Afghanistan. Right now there's 3 times as many contractors in Afghanistan as are our troops. Or, it's what the UAE does in the war in Yemen. I mean, they're fighting that war through mercenaries, Latin American, Colombian, former special operations, ex-US SEALs, ex-Green Berets, mercenaries. So that is, it comes down to political will and the will of the population. I think if we actually had national service in the United States of America, both military and civilian, our discourse about, going to other countries might become a little bit more circumspect than it is today.
Gentleman in the front here.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. Very interesting. I was looking at your point 10 here about identifying strategic geniuses early, and not just military, but also outside the military, and cultivating them. And my question is, that seems like a fantastic idea, and it seems like it wouldn't necessarily cost as much as the F-35 program. Yes. I mean, it'd probably be covered by the budget of Heritage and AEI easily.
Right.
And yet it's not done. I
Right.
mean, and I was just going to add that a couple of months ago, the now dismissed British defense minister spoke here at the Atlantic Council, and he was bemoaning the fact that in the West we don't have time for grand strategy. Nobody's doing it.
No.
So go out and find some billionaires and just set up an institute and go for it.
You know a billionaire or two? I can talk
They're
to
all
you.
over the place, believe me.
Okay. Well, we need that. Okay, so our strategic education, think about it. When does an officer in the U.S. military, the British military, start their strategic education? What year are they into their careers? Anybody know? Yes, 17, 18, 19 years of why do we wait so long? Let's do it at age 18, right? And they go to war college. And in my opinion, a lot of the war college curriculum is old rules of war. We need to, and that it's a moribund. We need to up that. And the civilian institutions are, frankly, even worse. There are some brilliant professors and there's some good programs. But by and large, political science does not want to touch war because it's unpalatable. At their own peril. As somebody once said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. We have a dearth of strategic thinking, yet we have adversaries which demonstrate strategic thinking capacity. And that's the primary threat. That's what this book's really about. How do we create a program that would be a great thing for like the Atlantic Council to figure out the eaches of that.
Question,
Yeah.
did you have a question in the front?
Very similar to that.
Yeah.
How do you, at what point were you said at 18 starting strategic education for junior officers, and how do you balance that with the tactical level requirements, and at what point do you shift entirely away from the tactical level requirements?
Right.
Or do you just simply create 2 tracks instead of a get both, where you create 2 tracks of a tactical level leader versus a strategic or operational level leader?
Well, okay, so just for background here, there are 3 levels in war. At the bottom is like the tactical level. That's like the level of the platoon or a John Wayne movie or military history often. That's sort of like the trenches. The operational level is like the campaign, designing a campaign. And the strategic level at the top is like the national security strategy or grand strategy. We're suffering at the strategic level, and this book is about the strategic level of war. I think that also that great strategists don't all wear military uniforms, right? And let's open this up. And I also think that liberal arts and humanities is a great education for strategic thinking. Because strategic problems are all full of ambiguity, and the liberal arts teach you to think about ambiguity. If you're like a cadet out of West Point and you're an English major, you have a BS degree. Think about that. You have a bachelor's because it's all engineering. So that's one thing I would do. And I think that you don't have to choose an either or. I think it should just be part of a young officer's education, is that there are 3 levels of war, and you have to think about all 3. I get officers right now who are lieutenant colonels, and they've never had to think about strategic. They think they're thinking strategically, but they're not. It's not their fault. But we need to start this earlier to be cognizant of it. And then we could talk about how do we get civilian strategists as well.
In the back there, gentleman with the beard.
Right, Pedro with the Osgood Center. What do you think the role of cyber warfare will be in the
I'm glad you
new
asked
rules
that.
of war?
Okay, so there's a couple of questions that come from this. So cyber right now, I'm a cyber skeptic, all right? You get 9 cyber experts in the room, and you ask them the question, what is cyber? You get 12 answers. They'll say cyber is like ones and zeros in space. And they'll say it can do all these magnificent things, and most of it is hokum. It's sales talk. So, they'll talk about Stuxnet in 2011, which sabotaged, Iranian nuclear program, but in reality, it had almost de minimis effects on their program. They just changed the software, replaced the centrifuges, and spun it up again. So cyber, what it does, it allows us to, it's old wine in new bottles. It allows us to do old things in new ways. It allows us to do sabotage, theft, spying, and propaganda. Those are as old as warfare. Just new ways to do it. People who talk then about, well, there's a hacker out there who can bring down all the electricity of the eastern seaboard. Cyber scare tactics have been wheeled out for 25 years with the same trope of the hacker. In truth, social science is very clear that squirrels are a bigger threat to our national security grid than any hacker, all right? But we don't make rodent warfare a new type of warfare, right? So cyber is the current thing. If you have a pet project, and I can see that you have one in mind, go to the Pentagon, put cyber-pet project, go like this, and money comes into your hands. So I think cyber is important for warfare, but it's overhyped to such a degree that it's become distracting, and people are becoming cynical to it. And I'm not just talking about myself. And this is the danger of it being the signal-to-noise ratio on cyber discussion. It's, as I say, it's generating a lot of heat, but not a lot of light. So there is a role for cyber, but it's not as sexy as everybody thinks it is.
Natalya, when we read Sean's rules of war, and we talk about shadow wars and using proxy forces and using mercenaries, working in this realm of information and propaganda, some of these things are things that democracies are very uncomfortable with. And you've dipped into Sean's book, you've looked at these, you've seen how the West has either tried to help or not tried to help in CAR and elsewhere. Can a democracy, do you think, in your expert opinion, can a democracy engage in these types of things, these shadow wars, these proxy fights, and still remain true to its ideals?
I guess I find it difficult to understand the question.
Yeah, well, Sean, maybe you can,
Sure.
since I'm talking
Yeah.
about your thing,
Yeah.
and then Natalya will react
Yeah.
to you a little bit. Because
Yeah.
I'm concerned when I read your book that you describe the world very well.
Right.
And I worry that the United States, if it is stooping to the level of its
Right.
adversaries, if it is fighting a counterinsurgency with tough ancient tactics, if it's engaging in propaganda, if it is running shadow wars.
Yes. So I'm an observer of modern warfare, and what I'm observing is that war is getting sneakier and cunning. I'm not advocating that. I'm not saying I love that, we should do it. I'm saying that's the direction of modern warfare. But we know from the Cold War here, from the Church Committee, that secrets and democracy are not compatible. So how does a democracy, if it has to get into the shadows to defend itself, how does it do that without losing its democratic soul? I don't have an answer. What I do is I with honesty, I flag it in the book, just like I flag the issue of ethics of war in the book. I bracket this, but I don't have a solution other than we have to have a national discourse about these issues. Otherwise, we're gonna be right back where we were in 1975, 76.
Natalya, you talked a little bit about the peace work in CAR as bringing war criminals into positions and the ethical questions around that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. How this durable disorder is going to sort of challenge our ethical standards as we try to, improve the lives of people who are surrounded by this disorder.
Yeah. Actually, there is one question I'm asking when we're talking is because there is in one way the question how do we win wars, but to me the question is how do we stabilize the world and from disorder get back to order, and democracy were one tool, and it's true that we're seeing that it's less and less. What we're seeing is more mercenarism, private interests, and even in the West, I think it's in Europe. You see that we're seeing some divisions, people trying to control the system, journalists finding it more and more difficult to tell the truth. We've seen in CAR 3 journalists being killed, Russian journalists being killed while they were investigating the Wagner group. So I think my question maybe that I'm asking myself, and I think we can all ask the question is, are we seeking peace, like bringing back some more order, or are we finding it more interesting to keep that disorder? Because when you have a system that is where everything is possible, then you create opportunities for some networks. And right now, I'm more and more from the school that can see that it's profitable. Disorder is profitable, and of course, democracy is completely dismantled. What we're seeing with the Russian interventionism is it's more and more dictatorship applying. The rules that are being developed by dictators. The control of local media, like we've seen local media proliferating by being financed by Russian supported everything, but so developing a speech that is in favor of the government, but also in favor of the Russian presence, and in the opposite, threatening the French interests. So, all this is happening, and it's part of the warfare you describe. But coming back to my central question is, are we talking about winning war, or are we talking about how do we stabilize the world?
Sean, can you react to that?
Sure.
Because that is really one of the things you talk about in the book.
One of the questions, and rule number 10 is victory is fungible, right?
Yeah.
What that means is that there's many ways to win, there's many ways to lose. In conventional war, you win on the battlefield. It's Waterloo, it's Gettysburg, but that's not true anymore. In fact, a battlefield victory guarantees almost nothing in modern war. Just Israel, when it went into war in 2006 with Hezbollah, learned that the hard way. So what does victory look like? There's not going to be a USS Missouri moment. A peace deal with the Taliban is not going to look like Japan. It's going to look like Vietnam. What victory looks like, it's the infinite game. It's like the business world. There will be up cycles and down cycles. It's like the Cold War. Was the Cold War even a war? Or is it just a metaphor? If you talk to people in the era, they would say it's a war. And that's the world we're entering once again. And that's historically the truth. There's no such thing as war or peace. There's war and peace. Most wars last for decades. The Peloponnesian War, the 30 Years' War, stuff like that. That's sort of the Cold War. That's the world that we're re-engaging in.
Other questions? You in the back, you've had your hand up for a while.
Hi, great talk. Doug Brooks, International Stability Operations Association, which is the association of contractors that work in these areas. Love Sean McFate, as I say, the world's only combat violinist.
Long time ago, yeah.
But yeah, just a couple of quick comments. First of all, for contractors, and you say there's 3 times as many contractors, of course, in Afghanistan, the majority are Afghans. So, you know, they don't really fall under the mercenary label, I don't think, if they're locals.
Yep.
The other thing, the one thing that I really think you go too far on is the mercenary, which is a loosey-goosey term, but the idea that a billionaire can hire an army. There are a lot of constraints on that, and you know the idea that you can have sort of a 007 villain with henchmen willing to die for the villain, it just doesn't happen. And the reality is the vast majority of people, former military, if you're talking about them, they're not going to do something that's going to put themselves or their families at risk or their long-term fortunes at risk. The closest thing you have, I would say, is the Wagner Group, the Russians. But even there, I think it's pretty clear that they don't do anything that's crossing Russian policy. If anything, they're doing stuff that carries out Russian policy, which fits in, I think, into your other points that you make. But the idea of like independent armies run by billionaires, I just don't see it, and I'd like your pushback
Sure.
on that.
Comment after you.
Well, I disagree with that. First of all, you have warlords in Africa, which are little more than just that. They're not billionaires, but they're like relative billionaires. You have Eric Prince, who's pitching a plan still to replace all U.S. troops in Afghanistan with 6,000 mercenaries. Mercenaries, not contractors, mercenaries. And why is that still floating around town? What's that?
Under Afghan law, it was U.S. law.
Well, Afghan has told Eric Prince to take a hike and never come home. So and also the extractive industry already uses armed contractors, which many people consider to be identical to mercenaries. Okay, you have a typology of armed contractor versus mercenary. The rest of the world is less convinced than you are on your typology. They look at any civilian, any foreign civilian in a war zone with a gun, doing paramilitary activities. They say that's a mercenary, whether you're Blackwater working for the United States of America or you're.
Extractive companies use local.
What's that?
Extractive companies use local. They
Well,
may have foreign companies, but
that doesn't the locality feature doesn't make him any less of a mercenary in the hands of many. Well.
Yes, you can, I think.
Well, I'll leave it to others.
Natalya, please.
Yeah.
CAR is full of mercenaries, and there can be Central African, there can be Chadian, Sudanese, but they work in a group that is a criminal group, and they're making money out of their activities. But I wanted to give one example. I think it was 2017. Someone probably close to the Equatorial Guinea president, so someone wealthy, probably into the oil sector, hired some soldiers from CAR. There were some were saying that even the president from CAR was aware, but they hired Chadian and CAR mercenaries who crossed Cameroon to reach Equatorial Guinea. They were attempting a coup. And these guys have been hired by someone. And this someone is part of the central government, wealthy, because he's been in power for a very long time, and he's trying to overthrow his boss to take his position. And this is something that is common. And maybe one last example is the fact that CAR is ungovernable, but in the meantime, these arms groups are quite interesting for various actors in the region. If you want to threaten, for instance, the Chadian government, if you have an armed group sufficiently equipped to threaten, you can, you need an oil contract, and you put pressure on the government rather than sending French troops or whoever. You just launch an operation from a mercenary from the region. That's even more efficient. And this is what we're seeing happening. There are some threats to Cameroon with armed groups being at the border. They are not there for nothing. There is a reason when someone with money inject sufficiently, it creates the real deal, the pressure.
Other questions here? You, sir, blue shirt in the second row.
So, I'm curious about Herb Rose. I'm curious about this new war. Isn't what the indigenous fighters are using against us in Iraq and Afghanistan what we encouraged them to use when the Russians were in Afghanistan back in the 80s?
Yes. Next question. I mean, not to be glib about it, but yeah. First of all, this type of warfare actually is not new. It's ancient. We've just forgotten it, and we've become so focused in our fixation on conventional warfare that we've forgotten that conventional warfare is just one type of many types of warfare. And our adversaries are playing this strategically against us. And we are saying, we're having debates about, is it war, is it not? We could even have a conversation right now is, are we already at war with Russia and China? And part of their strategy is to keep us from thinking we're at peace. So that's so yes, this is we've done this, we've been here before.
Gentleman in the back there.
Hi, I'm Ian Schwab with the Enough Project. I wanted to ask you about one difference since the Westphalian period that's not ancient, which is our wealth is no longer tangible. It's pieces of paper that are guaranteed by a nation state. That's what gives us wealth. And I was wondering how that differential from ancient times into sort of the new dynamics of new warfare, how does that sort of play out, and what differentials does that create?
Well, I mean, it's interesting you say that because we don't live in a free trade world, thanks to Bretton Woods, and we are no longer in a sort of a world where nation states controlled economies the way they once did in the imperial era. So in some ways, we can have this question of chicken or egg. Are nation states beholden to the international financial system or vice versa? And I think if you look at all the actors in the world, even including mercenaries or armed contractors or local guards, they also depend in some regard on the international financial system. And we've seen, like from Somalia kidnapping in 2011, they had a whole system set up, including international system. So this is an interesting question of who controls whom. I think nation states, by the way, I'm not saying they're going to disappear. I'm just saying in certain parts of the world, they're retreating. In other parts like West Europe, North America, East Asia, and other parts in between, they will remain strong. But we have to be more nuanced in how we think of global politics. It's not just, it's not just the 19th century. It's not just Kissinger's diplomacy book. Maybe the State Department should be new rules of diplomacy. The State Department should maybe have alliances with the Fortune 500 or something like that. Let's think creatively about what we need to do in the 21st century to achieve stability. If that is what victory kind of looks like, can we be doing other more creative things than the old playbook of just sort of nation-state instruments?
Sean, do you disagree with the pronouncement from McMaster's NSC and Mattis's Pentagon that we are in a great power competition? And should we do anything about Russia and China and their interventions in Africa, whether it's through the Wagner Group or through a Belt and Road Initiative?
So that's a great question. So first of all, I think that great power competition, this matters more, but everybody assumes immediately that's conventional warfare, and that's wrong, and that's the trap. So, one belt, one road. So, for example, China has a national security strategy. It's called the Three Warfare Strategy. The three warfare strategy, this is what that is. And they've been doing it for 15 years. It's influence operations, it's economic instruments of power, like Belt Road, and it's lawfare. It's not military, and it's working. It is working. And we need to be savvy to seeing that one belt, one road, for example, is not just liberalizing free markets, it's also a national security strategy. And we need to find ways to blunt it. And I talk about ways to do that in this book. But some of them, to your earlier point, may not be palatable to a democracy. But I'll tell you one thing, like, what does victory look like? Is it battlefield victory? I have a 3-year-old son. They teach Mandarin in DC public schools. Now, part of me, like, that's so cool, right? How cosmopolitan. But part of me is like, wait a minute. If Mandarin becomes the second language for everybody by 2050, is that victory or not? There are many ways to win and lose. That's rule number 10. I don't speak either, so I don't know, yeah. But maybe it's fine.
Natalya, in your work in Africa, in CAR and the surrounding area, have you seen the influence of China and its economic investments, and is it for good or ill?
Yes. Yeah, I would say the past 10, 15 years is really, they are everywhere. I've been in Cameroon for about 10 years, living there, and Cameroon is just a lot of Chinese companies. It's companies, operators. It's difficult to know who they are, but they are in the infrastructure, transport sector, in the mining sector. It's really the way they deal with the country is really a win-win. This is how they present it. You know, we're here to do business, and to the opposite to the West or Russia, they are not here to you know, give lessons, and this is why it's working, because they are here to shake hands and you know, money for money. So you can see that it's more and more citizens from China being everywhere, even in rural areas. And in CAR, it's particularly obvious since 2005, I would say. And since also the president was elected, he really took China as like a big ally. And we're seeing them, you know, in the mining sector, exploiting diamonds, gold, and, you know, other resources. And there are very, very high tensions with local communities because they don't respect any laws. But I wouldn't say that, you know, other nationals are really respecting laws, but the fact is that in number they represent a power. And sometimes, you know, the embassy will withdraw saying, look, they are private operators, we have nothing to do with them, so we can't control them. But, you know, when you realize that you know, I mean, there are some connections, clear connection between the embassy and these operators. It's just that they prefer to keep a distance, you know. So,
Sean, would we be better off canceling 1 or 2 F-35s and starting our own Belt and Road in Africa?
Well, I think we could, just the landing gear at F-35 would be enough. I think we should stop buying big ticket conventional war items, because we don't need any more. We already have the best conventional military. I'm not saying scrap conventional forces, but we don't need more. We need other things. We need to be, you know, economic instruments of power need to be developed. Strategic thinking needs to be developed. You know, influence operations, you know, diplomacy, outreach. There's a whole, when we talk about instruments of national power, where our government looks like a fiddler crab, where you have that one big claw and a minuscule one. That one big claw is the Department of Defense, and the minuscule one is everybody else. We just need a rebalancing, and we need to have some cunning in the way we think strategically, and then think about what we can live with as a democracy.
Other questions here? Oh, yes. That's okay.
Thank you for this great discussion. You know, it occurs to me that we do have phenomenal weapons, as Americans, and some of them are companies like Facebook, which is frankly, it's the tool of choice of so many authoritarian regimes that want to spread disinformation. But the actions of our Congress in response to this have been regulation and efforts to clip Facebook's wing. Is that the right thing? Is Facebook an asset? Is Facebook, I mean, you made a comment, fire is fire. Don't
Right.
blame fire. Does Facebook fall in that category? Should we be putting them on the military's payroll? I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Well, it's funny. I don't think you can put them on military's payroll. So there was this thing called Operation Maven or something like that, where they
Project Maven.
Yeah, Project Maven, yes, where the Department of Defense is working with Google, and there was sort of a small revolt within Google, like we don't want to touch anything involving warfare, and we could discuss about how relevant that was, but I think these companies, you can argue, are they a public utility? Should they be treated as such? Or is it unfair to hold them accountable? They're just a vessel for others. I do think that one thing we do need to think about is that when we think of multinational corporations, they're fundamentally different than, like, say, Chinese or Russian multinational corporations. So Huawei, right? Huawei works for Beijing. I mean, all multinationals work for Beijing. They collect for Beijing. The 5G network is an intelligence threat from many. Whereas our multinationals are truly independent. So Apple Computer refuses to unlock an iPhone in a counterterrorism case in LA, right? So we need to think about, they all have the same titles, but they're not the same things. We need to be more savvy about how do we use, or how can we partner with private sector entities in ways that advance all national interests and their self-interest as well. But I don't have the exact answer for exactly how to do with Facebook.
Sir.
Hi, my name is Jack Rapansky, unaffiliated. Are you proposing any solutions, or saying we're like totally over the barrel with respect to cases like Syria, Ukraine,
Yes.
Yemen, Libya, Somalia, and Venezuela as my basket of deplorables?
So the book is full of unorthodox solutions. We never really kind of got to some. I mentioned the idea of having an American Foreign Legions, plural, around the world in zones of disorder that we care about. I'm talking about how we need to change our strategy, our strategic thinking, how to develop a grand strategy, what a grand strategy is, how to reorient, how do you change the Pentagon? All of the top 4 stars have a similar profile. That profile needs to change. It's conventional war profile. So there's, how do we develop strategists, this gentleman's question. So I do have, and how do you wage shadow wars against autocracies? We always think that because we're democracies and we have elections that we are easy prey for autocracies, but they are even more vulnerable than we are. I suggest ways to do that. Some of it is dark arts, and I flag it as that. I'm honest about that. But it's, again, to provoke thinking, to sort of shock us out of this staid paradigm that where it's like a jacuzzi. We need to get out of the jacuzzi.
We're about out of time, but I just want you to elaborate just as a closing remark on that last comment that you made. And this, do you believe that we can make this leap and stay true to ourselves as a democracy?
So victorious nations are rare to change their way of warfare. I mean, look at France after World War I. They built the Maginot Line. I say we're doing the same thing today. Usually it takes a lot of blood before a country will change its warfare, and sometimes not even then. Again, look at all the big battles of World War I, and yet still people didn't want to change the way of warfare. The purpose of this book is to stimulate a national conversation to forestall such things. And I go around the country talking about this book, and vets and many other people get it. And they're, we're trying to foster sort of an intellectual insurgency that just asks questions. Ask basic questions like, how come, carriers don't deter China in the South China Sea? What is China doing in Africa that we should care about? Is this war? Is this not war? All those things. Those things now are not questioned deeply in this town. So that's what this book seeks to address and what we're prepared to do with as a democracy.
Sean, thank you. Natalya, thank you. Please give a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.